And today I'm really excited to discuss with you some qualitative research methods, specifically what they are, how they're conducted, and then I want to offer some more descriptive insights into some illustrative examples of how we might take our participants seriously. And this is kind of an anthropological phrase that they use quite often, and I'll explain that in a bit. So whilst you probably have come across, studied, or maybe even conducted your own qualitative study, I want to provide a more anthropological lens to this practice, because social anthropology actually has dealt with specifically this issue for over a century. And so many of the kind of like ethical dilemmas, the theoretical, the methodological concerns surrounding, how to design, how to conduct, and ultimately analyze these types of research has already been extensively discussed. And unfortunately, the kind of communication between anthropology and psychology is very, very limited, although a little better for psychiatry. So I think first I want to say just a very obvious fact about the world, and I think that is human life is fantastically complex. But I think as scientists, it's very easy to forget that actually we're trained to try and decompose what we study, these kind of phenomena of interest, into much smaller, manageable parts. We try to design very well-controlled experiments where we hope we're manipulating only a few variables and controlling for all the others. And then we make conclusions based off statistical analyses and different types of approaches. And then we end up with what we call a thin description, something that's a kind of like postulated or a generalizable fact or conclusion about the way things are. The other option, of course, and the main point of this talk, and one that I really want to motivate, is that actually the other option is to immerse ourselves within this sheer richness of human experience. And so here we can start to create what we might call thick descriptions. I think for example, it's very easy to recognize that when we talk about ourselves, or you even talk to your own participants, or you talk about how an event has happened, we often do so by invoking very long threads of history, cultural knowledge, and personal narratives to kind of present a very detailed picture of our lived experiences. And so our lived experiences are better understood as sitting within a landscape of very rich details, of extended histories, of perhaps socio-political tensions and anxieties. And so understanding this much broader landscape, I think, is not only important for situating our participants in the context from which they derive, but actually to also acknowledge that there's a huge range of diversity with the responses that you get, but also just by nature, you'll find a huge range of diversity within a single sample. And I put Kamala Harris on the side because I think she says it best in her rather infamous meme at the moment, when she says, "You think you just fell out of a coconut tree. You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you." And I think that very, very nicely sums up this issue. And so really, in our kind of like pursuit of studying human behavior, we should really engage all of these intricate layers of meanings and motivations and context, and allow us to become immersed in the worlds of the people and the groups that we study. But also, and this is the kind of second most important part of this, is to ethically and faithfully represent them. And here I want to just emphasize the word represent and representation, and kind of play on its construction a bit, that actually what we mean by represent is really we are representing our group. We're presenting them once again. We often go and study and try to gain knowledge about them, and then obviously we aim to publish our work so that there's a readership involved, and we are representing them. And that's a really important dimension to what we're doing here. And so I'm arguing here that it is in this very kind of deep dive of all these intricacies that we can start to capture the subtleties of human interactions, the richness of cultural narratives, and also the profound depth of personal stories. Ultimately, we complete this much larger mosaic that we say we're concerned with, and that is the mosaic of what it means to be human, what it means to have human experiences, the variety that exist. So with that more wafty description of why we should do qualitative, what does that actually look like? Well, in contrast to quantitative methods, of course, qualitative tends to stay away from numerical or statistical methods. And so you'll find things like case studies, which usually take a singular event, phenomenon, person, group, or institution, and offers a close analysis of that. We have grounded theory, which this is more about the kind of consequence of the work, that ultimately what's based in your observed data, you create or you generate a generalizable theory from your data, which can then be falsifiable. Then we have phenomenology and ethnography, and these really highlight the first person experience of lived experiences, really tapping into the immediacy of human experience. And these are the two that I'm going to focus on in the next three examples. And of course, there are different ways of collecting data as well. So we have interviews. Interviews, of course, can be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. Structured being perhaps the most rigorous, where you have a predefined list of questions that you ask your interlocutors or participants, and you kind of stay strict to that. And then the more unstructured you get, the more kind of degrees of freedom you give to your interlocutors to kind of let the conversation take its own life. Of course, still bounded within maybe a topic or certain other parameters that you've set. Groups, focus groups, are a really fantastic way of engaging a topic among multiple people. It's a really exciting opportunity to hear people almost like collaborate when they talk about and try to help you understand a certain element of whatever the experience is. But also you get to see contradictions. You get to see people who don't always see things in the same way, and see how they try to kind of refine their arguments and how new arguments emerge. And ultimately, you're left with this very rich discussion that you get to moderate. Then, of course, you can document all of this data and all of this communication that can then be submitted to a kind of like linguistic analysis. And so we can do things like content analysis, and then participant observation. Well, that's really the central crux of ethnography. That's the ability to participate or observe a particular society or group, or again, in an event, to really feel yourself that experience, become one of the participants. And again, that's something I'm going to focus on in the next three examples. So what I want to argue as well, and I said this was the second main point, is that the way that we represent, the way we represent, is not only a methodological concern, how we do it, but it is an ethical obligation too. And I think it's important to notice that when we engage individuals in research, we are entrusted with their stories and their perspectives. And so how we choose to portray these narratives can actually significantly impact how these people are understood by others, by our readership. They might be affected by policymakers who take on the work that we might publish if it affects them, and also how other people start to study this group. So as I hope to present in this talk, is that actually qualitative methods are a fantastic means by which we can start to effectively and authentically represent those we come to study. It is a very important but also incredibly challenging endeavor, because again, like we've said, we're dealing with lots of layers of intricate meaning, a lot of immediate data, let's say, but we also have the responsibility of respectfully retelling the stories of others with care, accuracy, and also empathy. And finally, I just want to qualify exactly what we mean when we say we want to take our participants and interlocutors seriously. And by that, we really mean that we should suspend any kind of assumptions that we have, either about the target phenomenon, about the people we're studying, or even about the way in which the world works, or how it should be experienced. We don't want to come in with predefined notions of meanings, of how things should be experienced, of how relationships are defined, what certain concepts mean to different people. And we don't really want to come in with a strong theoretical position. Instead, really, it's our participants and the data that we collect that should give rise to our conclusions. rather than trying to fit our data to predefined theories to reach an expected conclusion. And so in this way, it's more of a data-driven approach. Insofar as we work from the ground up, we work with the people themselves. Of course, there are exceptions to this, although it won't be the focus of this talk. But for example, you will have people who are interested in applying things like a feminist lens or a Marxist lens to a particular event or group, which is perfectly fine. And that engages a particular positionality, for example. But by and large, I want to motivate a more data-driven, on the ground, kind of maybe for psychiatry, patient-led approach. Okay, so we've spoken quite abstractly about what qualitative methods really involves and what they can afford us methodologically and also theoretically. But I want to turn to a very key ethnographic example that was an interdisciplinary collaboration between an anthropologist, Rita Astuti, and a few cognitive scientists who were really interested in the ideas of biological and social inheritance and how that's understood and practiced in the Viso community of Madagascar. Now, first of all, the Viso are a semi-nomadic fishing community off the southwestern coast of Madagascar. And Rita Astuti, who lived there for multiple years and worked with these people, noticed that there was a very unique way of engaging with newborns and children. And that is that when babies are born, they're understood to be this kind of wobbly, bendable, and boneless entities. And therefore, their physical appearance was said to change very easily as well. And specifically, they would say that the physical appearance would change by people that socially interacted with those children. So, for example, you would hear that, oh, your baby has the nose of the neighbor that's next to you, or of the local fisherman or the local news, whatever. But what you wouldn't find was any comparison with the parents. In fact, they would actively avoid comparing any physical traits of the baby to the parents themselves. And if the parents made any liking, it was considered rude. Okay. With that very short ethnographic detail, it might be fair to first kind of postulate or theorize that the Viso people do not distinguish between facts of biology and facts of sociality, in the sense that that the physical appearance doesn't seem to be understood to be inherited biologically. In fact, they say that the appearance is more determined by social interactions rather than our kind of Euro-American understanding of biological inheritance affecting by genetics, etc., etc. And so this poses an interesting question for psychologists who might be interested in kind of discovering the kind of cognitive templates of things like folk biology that we have assumed is a universal across cultures, that there is a way of understanding child development, that there is a kind of common notion of what biology and sociality means, even if those words don't translate perfectly. And so they wanted to test this quantitatively. And so they presented this adoption task where they said the following: imagine that child A is born from parent X, who has dark hair, brown eyes, and believes that chameleons have 30 teeth. But then that child A is adopted from birth and for the rest of their lives by parent Y, who has fair hair, blue eyes, and believes that chameleons have 20 teeth. Then they're asked, does the child look like parent X or parent Y, or what does child A look like, and what belief about chameleons does child A have? And interestingly, the overwhelming majority of the Viso do in fact understand and distinguish the facts of biology and the facts of sociality, even though that first ethnographic detail would suggest that they didn't, because they actively avoid that kind of distinction when they talk to one another. In fact, they understood it so much so that they actually started offering explanations in the middle of the experiment, trying to convince the experimenter that they understood the point of the task. And when they did further qualitative reviews and interviews, it revealed that actually they could quite clearly explain that there was what they called a physical template that was transferred from parent to child, and that there were processes of social learning. And this obviously begs the question of why then would they make this distinction in everyday life, actively avoiding the comparison of the child with its parents and actually privileging a perceived similarity with non-related or unrelated individuals. And I think this is where the combination of both thick and thin, of qualitative and quantitative, actually offers a much more complete picture, because they're both incomplete when you take them in isolation. And so Rita Astuti offers this explanation. Child development and parenthood ought to be understood and enacted for the Viso people as a social practice, something that extends beyond the biological parents. In fact, talking in this way is a strategy that helps to dissolve the idea that only the parents have exclusive ownership and rights and authority over the child's development, because this helps to dissolve the unique and exclusive relationship, because actually the community is very, very important in bringing up children. And so in this way, they're socializing parenthood and extends the child's bodily connections with those beyond the parents. There are now biological consequences, supposed biological consequences to this socialized parenthood. And so, as Astuti writes in her own words, it's about to create a community in which children are generated, nurtured, and molded by a much larger network of relations than the ones demarcated by their birth parents. Parenthood, again, has become socialized, and it's understood as a group practice that has biological consequences. And so I think we can intuitively understand this to some extent when we have proverbs such as it takes a village to raise a child. So in all, whilst the Viso may align with the Euro-American participants who did the similar experiment, in that they seem to demonstrate the same cognitive ability to distinguish between biological and social influence and development, actually the social expression and function of these beliefs are completely different. And the main crux of this example, and why I presented it today, is I want you to notice that actually in either anthropological or psychological inquiry, they only offer a partial and actually contradicting answers to each of their research questions. And so I want to argue that taking this much more holistic and quantitative and qualitative approach paints a much fuller picture. Okay, if anything is unclear, please do feel free to interrupt at any point. I'm going to turn to the next example, which was an ethnography I conducted a few years ago. That's me at the top, doing something we anthropologists call going native, trying out different ritual practices. And this I conducted with Northern Italian spiritual ritualists, where I basically stayed and lived with these people and practiced the rituals that I was interested in. And the ritual itself was called family constellation therapy. And this is a very contentious psychotherapy. And for the past few decades, there's been a real surge in interest and popularity for this psychodynamic psychotherapy. And to give a brief description of it, it integrates therapeutic methods from psychodrama, group psychotherapy, family therapy, existential phenomenology, but also Zulu ancestor reverence. It's almost completely disregarded by medical institutions and psychologists as a kind of pseudoscientific practice. And it's often clumped with what's being called the kind of New Age spiritualism, or sometimes called Western esotericism. But actually these were labels that all of my interlocutors, my participants, completely rejected and actually found quite annoying. So as a result, much of the literature has focused on kind of like placebo effect studies, or even like longitudinal psychiatric studies, which kind of dismiss this as a practice. And so for me, what was important was actually understanding the client patient experiences on the ground, and even understanding the wider socio-political context that these rituals were performed in, which were notably lacking. And again, here, the quantitative has rejected any investigation of the kind of lived experiences of many people, and actually what worked for a lot of people and was very transformative experiences. And in fact, one could argue it continues to stigmatize the deployment of alternative therapies. One key thing I found when I first started interviewing the leaders of these rituals, what we call facilitators, was that obviously I told them my intention of conducting an ethnography, and they said that I couldn't understand the practice unless I partook in it. I couldn't just be an external bystander and just observe and take notes. I had to partake in the ritual itself. So I did, and for me, it stopped becoming this kind of like externalist or observatory practice, but something that needed to be felt, to be experienced myself. So I'm going to quickly describe the ritual so you have an understanding of how it works, and then I'll give my conclusions on it. So family constellation therapy starts with around 20 to 30 strangers who usually sit in a circle, and then you have a leading facilitator who calls upon someone to work on whatever they've come to work on. So somebody might go up and say, you know, I have a really bad relationship with my father, and then they proceed to tell very factual statements about things that have occurred in their life without any kind of like emotional valence or any emotional significance. So they stop any phrases that are like, oh, I hate my mother, or you know, anything that might give away your feelings towards people. It has to be very factual. This happened, why happened, that happened, etc., etc. And then after that, the facilitator invites you to pick people out of the people in the circle to represent your family members or the people involved in the situation. So she'll usually say, you know, pick somebody to represent yourself, to represent your father, your mother, your sister, brother, etc. And then they'll be placed in the middle of the circle. And then as the client, you stay quiet for the rest of the therapy. You don't say a single word, no reactions. And the facilitator simply says action. And then what you find is that all of the people placed in the middle, the actors they're called, start to very spontaneously kind of behave in different ways. They start interacting with one another. They might start crying. They might start laughing. They might hug someone. They might be really angry towards someone. All very spontaneous with very little knowledge about the actual people they're representing. And I think with that description, most of you will start to understand why it's been discarded as a pseudoscience. But actually, that's not the importance of why I did this. I wasn't there to figure out, you know, how does this happen, or to postulate a theory about, you know, do these people become possessed, for example. It's more about what can this theory afford as an experience to the people there. What kind of people go there? Why does this have so much traction in Italy, for example, and not the UK? What is it about this experience that is so transformative? And so what I found was actually it was incredibly transformative for all of my interlocutors, and surprisingly, it was incredibly transformative for me as well. It really shifted my whole perspective on a relationship that with one family member that I had, and that I decided I had to work on because I wanted to be a participant and an observer, and it was transformative for me as well. So something that's very powerful about this practice is that whilst the dynamics unfold, the facilitator will construct these kind of very short sentences that summarizes what's happened, and they'll usually be very emotionally laden. They'll be very charged, and then you'll be invited to step into the middle of the group and to utter these words and kind of resolve the dynamic that's being performed in front of you. And that is incredibly powerful when there's a lot of emotions involved by all the people who are acting your family. And what I concluded was that the power of this practice was in the embodiment and the externalization of what are often quite traumatic dynamics being played out. And they actually offer you quite profound insights into your own life, something that one-on-one counseling or talking psychotherapies cannot actually afford. There seems to be something specific about visualizing and embodying certain experiences and reattending to them that works, at least for my interlocutors. So in other words, re-narrating and externalizing problematic dynamics helps to reinterpret and to reattend to one's issues. By creating an arena in which, you know, these strong emotions can be relived, they can be carefully investigated, and then they can be strung up into a very compelling narrative, whether it's true or false, that participants would actually go away and then reflect upon, and then they would say they make this ethical commitment to work on this issue that's been presented to them. Another key part of why I think this ritual is very effective, at least for my interlocutors, was that this was a kind of episodic type of ritual, in that it's a kind of singular event, something that's quite rare, very unique, and very powerful. And it's something that people actually feel like they can then turn a corner in their lives, start a new chapter. It becomes a significant checkpoint in their life. And the importance of this ethnography was that, of course, I had to suspend my own beliefs about, you know, how the world works, that I don't believe I can be personally possessed. But actually, when I was the actor, which is the people representing some family member, which I did over 60 times, every single time I knew exactly what to say and do, which sounds, of course, sounds a bit bizarre, but was something that wasn't to be questioned, and just something that you had to prepare yourself in a phenomenological way. You had to prepare yourself for your body to have these emotions arise and to enact them in ways that were, for you, truthful. And I think that is the power of what qualitative methods can afford you. Not only that I had my own transformative experiences, which, you know, previously I might have dismissed very quickly, but actually you can start to live the experiences of your participants, have that phenomenological first person experience, and come away with a new profound understanding of how these people interact with one another, why these people were joining these rituals, and what kind of effects these rituals had for them. And these are very different questions to what quantitative analyses would seek to answer. So with that, I'll leave that example, but I'm very happy to answer more questions on that. The next one I want to talk about refers more to the ethical dimension of qualitative research. And so I want to qualify this with a few questions for thought. And these are that we constantly deal with in anthropology, and psychology ought to as well. Can we and should we ever retell someone's story if it's not our own? How do we keep faithful to someone's experiences, even if we might disagree or might not share the same reality? For example, how do I write about the experiences of Christian fundamentalists if I don't believe in God? Should I, as an anthropologist or qualitative researcher, write as if God does exist and is a real active interactant in their lives? Does it matter? And what gives us the rights to be the spokesperson of that story anyway? Who picks which are the most important parts of the data to retell? And how do you prevent things like an ethnography becoming sensationalist, or worse, mischaracterization of their experiences? And so this, I want to argue that actually an active collaboration between researcher and interlocutor or participants really helps that. I think whilst it's easy to say we should suspend our, you know, assumptions about how certain societies work, we inevitably will have them anyway. And so when we come to study these people, we might still come in with a certain focus, or we might find certain behaviors or certain emotions more salient for us than they actually are for the interlocutors. So by presenting your work back to the interlocutors and letting them have the space to give you feedback about what actually is pertinent, if you've missed something, if something's overstated, something's understated, then you can start to create this active collaboration where there's a collaboration of voice. And this final example that I'd like to give, I think, did this in the most perfect way, and something that I think most people would never have expected, including the designers themselves. And that is a very recent video game called Hellblade. Now, Hellblade was developed by Ninja Theory, which is part of Xbox, and it's centered on psychosis, which of course is an experience of schizophrenia, for example. And it really centers about how this should be represented, understood, reenacted, but also how we can allow other people to simulate or embody this experience in a way that's respectable, accurate, but simultaneously destigmatizing. And so Hellblade presents as a product of continuous collaboration and negotiation between storytellers, visual effects artists, but also experts of psychosis. And here they used experts by experience, so obviously those people with psychosis, and also experts by research, including Professor Paul Fletcher, who works here at Cambridge Neuroscience and Department of Psychiatry. And so their handling of psychosis as an audiovisual experience is aesthetically impressive, as you can see, but actually, more importantly, realistic and very respectful. And so they held an event in Cambridge, actually, where they showcased this exciting collaboration. And the feedback that people with psychosis gave was all very, very positive. In fact, they said it was surprisingly accurate of how the gameplay's depiction of episodes of psychosis were, especially with the constant whispering of voices, being unsure if other people could hear those voices in the game, the frightening but actually sometimes quite beautiful transformations of objects around them, and then ultimately the strong delusions that come to narrate and unfold the everyday moments that they inhabit. And in fact, something important about this game is that there are no tutorials, there's no heads-up display, there's no text. You really have to figure out for yourself. And actually, a key part of it is to listen to the voices and to take all of what we can recognize as hallucinations very seriously. In fact, you cannot ignore them. You cannot like preemptively say, oh, she's having an hallucination, I better ignore that. In fact, you need to attend to them to progress through the game because they inform what the next steps are. And I think that's a really beautiful way of characterizing what schizophrenia or people with psychosis might be experiencing in those moments. Of course, this is a video game and a psychological horror game, so there is an element of artistic license to it. And in fact, they spoke about the balance between, again, this sensationalizing, but also kind of underplaying psychotic experiences, whilst also balancing, designing a psychological horror game, but also not depicting schizophrenia or psychosis as this kind of like hellish landscape or something that's always tormentful. So I want to argue here that actually Ninja Theory sought to address this whole art of representation that we've been talking about, this representation, in probably the most fair and balanced way that I've seen. And in the anthropological sense, they really did take their interlocutors seriously. They took people with psychosis seriously and represented them. Obviously, they've done this by not only accepting and non-judgmentally understanding these real lived experiences of psychosis, but actually inviting these people to then be active agents in the construction of their own representation. And I don't think that can be understated. And more than this, they've obviously allowed people who don't share this same reality, people who don't have psychosis, to actually engage, understand, and even embody these experiences in a way that reduces stigma, increases obviously knowledge and awareness around these often unshared realities of people with psychosis. And here there's a beautiful phrase from an anthropologist, Vivero de Castro, who talks about how, yes, we could look at all the different world views that there are, but actually, why don't we look at worlds of visions that everyone lives in their own defined worlds that we need to tap into, that we need to be invited within to really truly start to understand. And the most important part, and actually probably one of the most moving parts of the event that they showed us, was a huge influx of messages from people with schizophrenia who played the game. And I'll read the two quotes. They said, "I hope those around me and my partner can now understand how real the darkness can be. Thank you for this gift. With this game, I found the language I need to talk about my childhood illness." And so there's also this kind of, again, what I spoke about, an ethical obligation. There's this pragmatic side that actually has had a real world impact. And this is one of the, I think, the strongest benefits of qualitative research is actually engaging real lived experiences and representing them in a way that's respectful, in a way that goes beyond just an intellectual task of understanding people or just contextualizing people, but actually making an impact. So with that, I want to say that qualitative research methods necessarily engage the nuances of everyday living, of human behaviors in a context of histories, of socio-political landscapes, of cultural meaning, and it has the potential for real world impact, and especially for those who might be less well understood or those who do not fit normal expectations in the statistical quantitative sense, normal being obviously normality. And so here, qualitative research methods, I think, offers us a way really to effectively engage the sheer richness of people's lived experiences, rather than just reducing them to some number in a statistical sense, such that we can actually take participants seriously, both through these kind of thick and thin descriptions. Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer any questions, whether that's on the ethnographies or qualitative methods generally.